The Yom Kippur War of 1973 brought Israel to the brink of disaster. The country was almost overwhelmed by the surprise attack of the Egyptians and Syrians on the holiest day in the Jewish religious calendar. Although after 3 weeks of fighting, the Israelis dealt both the Egyptians and the Syrians unquestionable defeats. In 2008, Hosni Mubarak, the Egyptian president, said that the conflict breathed new life into Egypt. He said Egypt and Syria's initial victories in the conflict eased Arab bitterness over Israel's victory in the 1967 Six-Day War and ultimately put the two nations on a path of peaceful coexistence. The Yom Kippur War, the Ramadan War, the October War, also known as the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, was fought from October the 6th to the 25th, 1973, by a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria. Egypt's initial war objective was to use its military to seize a foothold on the east bank of the Suez Canal, and then use this to negotiate the return of the rest of Sinai. Yom Kippur is the one day in the year that the whole of Israel comes to a halt, including all radio and television broadcasts. The surprise attacks on the 6th of October 1973 should not have caught the Israelis unprepared, as there had been enough intelligence, including information from the closest aide to Egypt's president, Anwar Sadat, former President Nasser's son-in-law, who was an Israeli agent. He confirmed the date and the time of the surprise attacks, although the time was incorrect by a few hours. In the months preceding the attacks, the Egyptians had carried out large maneuvers, which had led the Israelis to call up large parts of the reserve army at a huge economic cost. The country was in the midst of an economic downturn and could barely afford the calling up of the reserves. Thus, when the Egyptian army was fully mobilized for the attack, it was not taken seriously enough and perceived as another false alarm. In addition, Israel was still basking in the false sense of glory of the Six-Day War and did not believe that the ability of the Egyptian and Syrian soldiers had improved. The Israelis also mistakenly underestimated the successful integration of Russian anti-aircraft technology, which cost the Israeli Air Force dearly in the early days of the war. Unlike the Six-Day War, it took Israel many days and the loss of many of its aircraft before it established supremacy in the air. The Egyptians had prepared for an assault across the canal and deployed 5 divisions, totaling 100,000 soldiers, 1,350 tanks, and 2,000 guns and heavy mortars for the onslaught. Facing them were 450 soldiers of the Jerusalem Brigade, spread out in 16 forts along the length of the canal. There were only 290 Israeli tanks in all of Sinai, divided into 3 armored brigades, only one of which was deployed near the canal when hostilities commenced. At exactly 2 p.m. on Saturday the 6th of October, Yom Kippur 1973, Operation Badr began with a large airstrike. More than 200 Egyptian aircraft conducted simultaneous strikes against 3 air bases, Hawk missile batteries, 3 command centers, artillery positions, and several radar installations. Airfields at Refidim and Bir Tamada were temporarily put out of service. The aerial assault was coupled with a barrage from more than 2,000 artillery pieces for a period of 53 minutes against the Bar-Lev line and Rear Area Command Post. Under cover of the initial artillery barrage, the Egyptian assault force of 32,000 infantry began crossing the canal in 12 waves at 5 separate crossing areas, from 1405 to 1730, in what became known as the Crossing. The Egyptians prevented Israeli troops from reinforcing the Bar-Lev line and proceeded to attack the Israeli fortifications. Meanwhile, Egyptian engineers crossed over to breach the sand wall. Despite fierce resistance, the Israeli Reserve Brigade garrisoning the Bar-Lev forts was overwhelmed. Within 6 hours, 15 strong points had been captured as Egyptian forces advanced several kilometers into the Sinai. The northernmost fortification of the Bar-Lev line, codenamed Fort Budapest, withstood repeated assaults. and remained in Israeli hands throughout the war. Once the bridges were laid across the canal, additional Egyptian infantry with the remaining portable and recoilless anti-tank weapons began to cross the Suez Canal, while the first Egyptian tanks started to cross in 2030. Thus, in the first wave of attacks, the Egyptians and the Syrians benefited from the fact that their ground forces were able to attack with almost total impunity from the air. The Agranat Commission, set up in Israel after the war had ended, concluded that there was a confluence of factors causing the intelligence errors. In addition, the Bar-Lev Line, Israel's equivalent of the French Maginot Line of the Second World War, proved to be as inadequate as the Maginot Line itself. Shortcuts had been taken in the building of the fortifications, including watered-down cement. The use of water cannons by the Egyptians to bring down the high walls built by the Israelis on the banks of the Suez Canal for added protection allowed the Egyptians to pour troops across the canal in large numbers. Israeli armored forces launched counterattacks from October the 6th to the 8th, but they were often piecemeal and inadequately supported and were beaten back principally by the Egyptians using portable anti-tank missiles. The Egyptian units generally would not advance beyond a shallow strip for fear of losing the protection of their surface-to-air missiles, the SAM batteries, which were situated on the west bank of the canal. Between October the 9th and the 12th, the American response was a call for a ceasefire to be put in place. Egypt and Syria had heavily fortified their side of the ceasefire lines with surface-to-air missile batteries provided by the Soviet Union, against which the Israeli Air Force had no time to execute an attack on the Egyptian air defense system due to the element of surprise. As a result, Israel, which had invested much of its defense budget building the region's strongest air force, would see the effectiveness of its air force curtailed in the initial phases of the conflict by these surface-to-air missiles. On October the 9th, the IDF chose to concentrate its reserves and build up its supplies while the Egyptians remained on the strategic defensive. American President and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger held back on a full-scale resupply of arms to Israel. Short of supplies, the Israeli government reluctantly accepted a ceasefire on October the 12th, but Egyptian leader Anwar Sadat refused to do so. The Soviets started an airlift of arms to Syria and Egypt, which forced the Americans to do the same. With an airlift in full swing, Washington was prepared to wait until Israel's success on the battlefield would persuade the Arabs and the Soviets to bring the fighting to an end. The Israelis decided to counterattack once Egyptian armor attempted to expand the bridgehead beyond the protective SAM umbrella. The attack, codenamed Operation Gazelle, was launched on October the 15th. IDF forces, spearheaded by Ariel Sharon's division, broke through the Tassa corridor and crossed the Suez Canal to the north of the Great Bitter Lake. After intense fighting, the IDF progressed towards Cairo and advanced southwards on the east bank of the Great Bitter Lake and in the southern extent of the canal right up to Port Suez. It was important for the Americans that the fighting should be ended when all parties could still emerge from the conflict with their vital interest and self-esteem intact. On October the 22nd, the United Nations brokered ceasefire unraveled, with each side blaming the other for the breach. By October the 24th, the Israelis had improved their positions considerably and completed the encirclement of Egypt's Third Army and the city of Suez. This development led to tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, and a second ceasefire was imposed on October the 25th to end the war. The United States would not accept the destruction of the Egyptian Third Army Corps. Israeli progress towards Cairo was brought to a halt when a ceasefire was declared on October the 24th. By the end of the war, the Israelis had advanced to positions some 101 kilometers from Egypt's capital, Cairo. Ceasefire agreements were put in place at kilometer 101, where Henry Kissinger, the American Secretary of State, played an integral part.